Welcome to the deep dive. You've brought us a source, maybe something you need to get your head around quickly, or, just something that sparked your curiosity. Our job, to dive in, dig around, and pull out the gold, the key insights. Today we're tackling something really fundamental. Life itself, actually, and a powerful force that interacts with it. Genetics and radiation. Our source is this fascinating book, The Genetic Effects of Radiation, by Isaac Asimov and Theodosius Dobzhansky. Two giants, really. So we're going to unpack what they tell us about, well, the machinery of inheritance, how it can suddenly change this invisible thing called radiation, and, importantly, its consequences. For us, for future generations. And just to be clear, everything we talk about today comes strictly from this source.
That's right. The book really lays out this complex relationship between our genetic blueprint, the instructions for who we are, the energy that's all around us, even passes through us. It's all about understanding the basic rules of life's code and, crucially, how that code can get altered.
Okay, let's jump right in then. Asimov and Dobzhansky, they start small, right? At the very beginning. The absolute basics of how we inherit things.
They do. They paint the picture starting really small. You begin as just one single fertilized ovum.
Yeah.
A single cell. And from that one cell, through, countless divisions, you grow into this incredibly complex organism. Trillions of cells.
And guiding that whole process, there are instructions?
Exactly. Instructions that determine how you develop. And these live inside structures in each cell called chromosomes.
The source gives a number for humans, doesn't it? 23 pairs?
Yep, 23 pairs. So 46 chromosomes in total in most cells. And when your ordinary body cells divide, that's through a process called mitosis, the chromosomes make exact copies of themselves. This ensures every new cell gets a perfect, complete set of those instructions.
So ideally, these instructions are passed down perfectly during just regular cell division.
That's the idea, yes. The book explains them as being like recipes, essentially. These recipes guide the creation of enzymes, which are, the chemical workhorses inside the cell. Different recipes mean different sets of enzymes, and that ultimately accounts for, everything we see. A giraffe's long neck, a human brain. It all comes down to those enzymes.
And the individual steps in those recipes, those are the genes.
Precisely. The book describes chromosomes as being made up of these smaller sections called genes. Each gene holds the blueprint for making a specific protein, or maybe part of one, following this very precise genetic code.
So if a gene's recipe is flawed, imperfect, you might get something noticeable, an abnormality, like color blindness. That's the example they use.
Exactly that. And the book also makes it clear that genes can come in different versions or varieties. Think blue eyes versus brown eyes, different varieties of the same eye color gene, and they introduce terms for this, like homozygous.
Right, that's when you have two identical versions of a gene.
And heterozygous is when you have two different versions on that chromosome pair.
And if you're heterozygous, one version might kind of overpower the other, be dominant, like brown eyes over blue.
Correct. The effect of that brown eye gene shows up. Even if the blue eye gene is right there alongside it, it masks it.
Okay, so that covers copying instructions in regular body cells. But how did these recipes actually get passed from parents to kids? That involves the sex cells, right?
Yes, and that's a totally different kind of cell division. It's called meiosis. Through meiosis, the sex cells, sperm and eggs, end up with only one chromosome from each pair, just a half set.
Then fertilization, sperm meets egg.
Exactly. And that brings together a full set of pairs again, one chromosome from each parent's half set.
And this is where all the variety comes from, isn't it? Even in one family.
Huge variety. The book points out that the chromosome pairs separate randomly during meiosis. Pure chance which one goes into which sex cell. With 23 pairs, that random sorting alone means a single person can make sex cells with, millions of different possible chromosome combinations. And then think about the random pairing of which sperm fertilizes which egg. The book calculates that even a single couple could theoretically produce children with trillions of unique chromosome combinations.
Wow, trillions, just from shuffling the existing genetic deck. That's incredible.
And they add another layer, too, crossovers, where chromosomes can actually swap pieces during meiosis.
Creating even more novel gene patterns.
Exactly. Patterns that didn't exist in either parent.
Okay, so this massive amount of shuffling explains a lot of the variation we see between people. But the source says it's not the whole story.
Right. It explains variations based on existing gene types. But sometimes the change is something completely new, not just a reshuffle. And that, the book says, is a mutation.
Okay, so a mutation is a sudden change in the chromosome itself. Structure or maybe chemical makeup?
Yes, a change that produces a genuinely new characteristic, one that didn't just come from shuffling the parents' genes.
Got it. And they make an important clarification. Blue-eyed kid from two brown-eyed parents who both carry the blue-eye gene, that's not a mutation.
Correct. That's just the shuffling revealing a hidden recessive gene.
A real mutation is something like, say, color blindness appearing out of the blue with no family history.
Precisely. And the book then breaks down mutations into types. There are chromosome mutations, bigger, structural changes you can often see under a microscope, like having a whole extra chromosome.
They use Down syndrome as an example there, right?
Yeah.
An extra chromosome 21 making 47 total instead of 46.
And then there are gene mutations. These are more subtle chemical alterations within the structure of a single gene itself, much smaller scale.
And these mutations, they can happen in regular body cells, somatic mutations.
Or they can happen in the sex cells, sperm or eggs. Those are genetic mutations.
And the difference is crucial, isn't it? Somatic mutations affect just the individual?
Right. They aren't passed on. Though the book notes they can still be serious, it mentions a potential link to cancer, for instance.
Genetic mutations, those are passed down, affecting future generations.
Exactly. They become part of the inheritance pattern.
So the book talks about spontaneous mutations. These just happen naturally. Why?
Well, the author suggests it's mostly down to the sheer complexity of copying DNA, replicating all those genes perfectly, trillions of times throughout life. It's an incredibly intricate process, and sometimes, they say, just through random molecular bumps and jostles, sheer accident. The copying machinery makes a mistake, a wrong turn.
And the book makes a really key point. Random changes to a highly complex, optimized system are usually bad, right?
Generally, yes. Organisms are products of millions of years of natural selection, fitting them to their environment. Randomly tweaking that finely tuned gene set is far more likely to cause harm than good.
But, and this is crucial too, the authors immediately say that even though they're often bad, these mutations are absolutely essential for evolution.
Right, because the environment isn't static, it changes. And a mutation that's harmful in one context might actually become beneficial in another.
Like their example of skin color. Light skin might be bad in the tropic sunburn risk, but good in northern latitudes for vitamin D production.
Exactly. Prevents rickets, where sunlight is scarce. Or nearsightedness. Definitely a disadvantage for a primitive hunter.
Yeah, can't see the prey or the danger far off.
But in our modern world, focused on reading, close work, maybe less of a disadvantage. The book even speculates it could indirectly be helpful in some contexts.
They also mention a gene's effect might depend on how common it is.
Yeah, like a gene for, say, preferring solitude. Might be good if rare produces explorers, maybe. But if it becomes very common in a society needing cooperation, maybe not so good. It's complex.
So these spontaneous mutations constantly create new gene variations, good, bad, neutral, depending on the situation, and this feeds the gene pool.
Precisely. It provides the raw material, the options, that allow a species to adapt over long periods as conditions change.
But there's a cost to this flexibility. The book calls it the genetic load.
Yes, the genetic load. It's the sort of burden of undesirable or deleterious genes that accumulate in the population's gene pool simply because mutations keep happening.
Some mutations are lethal, right? They prevent development entirely or cause death before reproduction.
Yes, things like severe malformations, certain inherited blood disorders mentioned in the source.
Now, if a lethal gene is dominant, it gets weeded out quickly, doesn't it?
Right. Anyone inheriting even one copy dies, so they can't pass it on. Natural selection removes it in that same generation. But recessive harmful genes, or lethal ones, those can hide. In heterozygous individuals, people carrying one copy of the bad gene and one normal copy. They usually appear healthy, they don't show the trait, but they can still pass that hidden harmful gene onto their children.
So these recessive bad genes can persist for generations.
Exactly. And the book gives a really striking example to illustrate how many might be out there. They say, imagine a lethal recessive gene where being homozygous, having two copies, occurs in 1 in a million births.
Okay, very rare.
Seems rare, yes. But the math shows that for this to happen, about 1 in 500 people in that population must be carriers heterozygous.
Wow, 1 in 500 carrying it. Even if only 1 in a million shows it, that's a lot more carriers than you'd think.
It really highlights that this genetic load is, well, quite significant. It's the price we pay for mutation, for evolvability. The book notes that generally a species' ability to reproduce is high enough to compensate for the individual's lost due to this load.
And the size of this load, it reaches a kind of balance.
Yes, an equilibrium. It's determined by the rate new harmful mutations arise versus the rate natural selection removes them from the gene pool.
But then they add another layer of complexity, talking about heterozygote advantage.
Ah, yes. Sickle cell anemia is the classic example they use. If you inherit 2 copies of the sickle cell gene, you get a very severe, often deadly disease.
But if you inherit only 1 copy,
You're heterozygous. You might have some mild issues. But crucially, the source states you seem to have increased resistance to certain types of malaria.
So in areas where malaria is common, carrying 1 copy is actually beneficial, an advantage.
Exactly. It shows how complicated it is. Good or bad isn't always simple. It depends on the environment and whether you have 1 copy or 2.
Okay, so we have this natural background mutation rate creating this genetic load. How on earth do scientists figure out what that rate actually is, especially for humans? The book says it's tough.
It is tough. Long lifespan, relatively few offspring per individual. It makes direct measurement very difficult in humans. So they often turn to studies on other organisms, ones that reproduce quickly and have lots of offspring.
Like the fruit fly, Drosophila. The book mentions it specifically.
Yes, Drosophila has been a workhorse for genetics research for decades. The underlying assumption is that the basic genetic machinery, the way mutations happen, is probably quite similar across many species, including us.
The source mentions Herman J. Muller's work back in 1927.
Right. His Nobel Prize-winning work with Drosophila gave some of the first estimates. He found a typical mutation rate for a given gene might be around 1 in 100,000.
1 mutation per gene every 100,000 times a chromosome gets copied.
Roughly, yeah. And the book then tries to scale that up to humans. If we assume humans have, say, at least 10,000 different genes,
Okay.
then the chance of at least 1 mutation happening in any of those genes in a single human sex cell, sperm or egg, during its formation, is estimated to be maybe 1 in 10.
1 in 10 sex cells carries a newly mutated gene.
A potentially deleterious one, yes. And if you include mutations that are only slightly harmful, weakly deleterious, the book suggests that chance could be as high as 1 in 2.
Wait, hold on. According to this source, nearly half of all human sperm and eggs might carry at least 1 new, potentially harmful mutation. That seems incredibly high.
It's a sobering number, isn't it? It
Yeah.
really emphasizes the weight of that genetic load we discussed.
Okay.
And the authors then connect this to modern life. They point out that medical care helps people survive conditions that might have been naturally selected against in the past.
What's severe nearsightedness or diabetes?
Exactly. From a humane perspective, we absolutely provide that care. But the book notes a consequence is that some of these slightly deleterious genes might persist in the gene pool more than they would have otherwise. It changes the balance of that genetic equilibrium.
So given this existing natural rate of mutation and genetic load, the big concern becomes anything that increases that rate, right?
Yeah.
Adds more mutations on top.
Precisely. And this is where the book introduces the 2 big modern concerns: synthetic chemicals and especially energetic radiation.
They suggest chemicals are maybe less of a genetic threat, more somatic.
Generally, yes, according to the source. Chemicals tend to react where they make contact. So they might cause local damage, like cancers in tissues they touch, but they're less likely to travel through the body and reach the gonads in concentrations high enough to significantly affect the sex cells.
But radiation, that's different. How does the book define radiation?
Broadly, really, as anything spreading out from a source. Could be waves, could be particles. They contrast low-energy forms, like sound or visible light, which mostly just transfer energy as heat, with the more energetic types.
Like ultraviolet light from the sun causes sunburn, skin cancer.
Yes, UV has enough energy to cause chemical changes in skin cells, but importantly, it doesn't penetrate very deep into the body.
Okay, but then we get to the really energetic stuff. X-rays, gamma rays.
Exactly. The book calls these ionizing radiation. That's the key term.
Ionizing, meaning they can knock electrons off atoms.
Precisely. They hit atoms with enough force to break them apart, creating electrically charged fragments called ions. And this category also includes energetic particles, cosmic rays from space, alpha and beta particles emitted by radioactive materials, all ionizing.
And the book explains why this ionizing radiation is so dangerous biologically. It's not just direct hits.
Right. It can directly damage DNA, but a major mechanism is indirect. Ionizing radiation can hit a water molecule, and our bodies are mostly water, remember. That collision creates highly reactive, unstable chemical fragments called free radicals. And these free radicals can then drift a short distance and damage nearby critical molecules like DNA, So the radiation doesn't even need to score a direct hit on the gene itself.
And unlike UV, this stuff is penetrating.
Highly penetrating. It can go right through the body and reach the internal organs, including the gonads, the ovaries, and testes.
Which means it can cause genetic mutations
No.
affecting future generations. That's the crucial link.
Absolutely.
Now, the source is careful to point out that ionizing radiation isn't entirely artificial, right? There's a natural background level.
Yes, very important point.
Yeah.
We're constantly exposed to low levels of it. It's always been part of Earth's environment. Background radiation.
Where does it come from?
Two main sources mentioned. Radioactive elements naturally present in rocks and soil, things like uranium, thorium, and their decay products. And the other is cosmic rays, high-energy particles coming from outer space hitting the atmosphere.
The book introduces units to measure this stuff. Rayskin, rad.
Yes, Röntgen R and RAD, radiation absorbed dose, measure the physical intensity or the absorbed energy. But they emphasize the REM Röntgen equivalent, man. That's the important one for biological effects.
Why REM?
Because different types of radiation cause different amounts of biological damage, even if the absorbed energy, RADs, is the same. Alpha particles are more damaging than gamma rays, for instance. The REM accounts for this difference, giving a single number that reflects the potential biological harm, regardless of the radiation type.
Makes sense. And what's the average natural dose, according to the book?
They estimate the average background dose to the gonads is about 3 REMs over a 30-year period. That's roughly 1 generation.
And that varies quite a bit depending on location.
Oh, yes. Higher altitudes get more cosmic rays, so Denver has more than Harrisburg, PA. And some places have much higher levels of radioactive minerals in the ground. They mention Kerala in India as an example, with high natural thorium levels.
Plus, some comes from inside us, naturally radioactive stuff in our bodies.
A small amount, yes. Isotopes like potassium-40 and carbon-14 are naturally present in our tissues and contribute a little bit to our internal dose.
Okay, so that's the natural baseline. Then the book says humans started adding to it.
Starting in the late 19th century, discovery of X-rays, then radioactivity, then creating artificial radioisotopes for medicine and industry.
And the big one, 1945 onwards, nuclear weapons.
Yes, nuclear explosions release intense, immediate radiation, mostly gamma rays, but they also create large amounts of radioactive byproducts, fission fragments. This becomes fallout, spreading through the atmosphere and eventually settling back to Earth, adding to global radiation levels.
Yeah, the book tries to quantify this extra man-made dose, at least for the time it was written.
It does. Looking at medical uses, occupational exposure for radiation workers, fallout from weapons testing.
And what was the biggest contributor back then?
According to the 1963 U.S. data they cite, by far the largest slice of the man-made pie was medical procedures, primarily diagnostic X-rays. They estimated medical sources contributed about 50 milligrams per year out of a total average man-made dose of around 67 milligrams per year.
So if you add that up over 30 years...
It comes out to around 5.5 REMs from man-made sources over a generation based on that data.
Which is almost double the natural background dose of 3 REMs.
Effectively tripling the total gonad dose for the average person in a technologically advanced country like the U.S. at that time, according to the source. A significant increase.
And mostly from medical X-rays. That's quite a finding.
That was, yes.
Okay, so we've got this increased exposure. What does the radiation actually do to living tissue? The book talks about radiation sickness.
Yes, at high doses, the damage is severe. The ionizing radiation disrupts complex molecules, messes up the cell's machinery, and can kill cells directly. They mention the tragic stories of early pioneers like the Curies, who suffered severe health problems, and of course the effects seen in the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
And the symptoms, hair loss, skin burns, blood count changes, they show up most in tissues that divide rapidly.
Exactly. Bone marrow, the lining of the gut, hair follicles. Cells that are constantly reproducing are more vulnerable because the DNA damage interferes with cell division.
Now, the source makes a critical distinction about dose when comparing these immediate body effects, somatic, versus the long-term genetic effects.
Yes, this is really important. For somatic effects, like getting radiation sickness symptoms, there seems to be a threshold dose.
Meaning you need a certain amount before you see the effect.
Right. Your body can repair or compensate for a small amount of cell damage. Undamaged cells can take over. You need to exceed a certain level of damage before the whole system shows symptoms.
But for genetic effects, mutations in the sex cells pass to offspring. The book says it's totally different, based on their early work anyway.
Completely different picture. According to that initial understanding, particularly from Muller's fruit fly experiments in 1927. His work indicated that the number of mutations produced in the sex cells was directly proportional to the total radiation dose absorbed by the gonads.
Double the dose, double the mutations. A straight line relationship.
Pretty much, yes. And the really crucial point was the claim of no threshold.
No safe dose.
For genetic effects, yes. According to that view, any amount of ionizing radiation reaching the gonads, no matter how tiny, carried a proportional risk of causing a mutation. Each hit added to the potential genetic burden for future generations.
And the reasoning was about repair. Or lack of it.
The reasoning was that once a mutation occurs in a sperm or egg cell, if that cell is involved in fertilization, the resulting organism starts from that single damaged blueprint. There's no pool of undamaged cells to compensate or repair after fertilization, unlike with somatic damage in the parent's body.
Okay. The book does put this in perspective, though. Natural background radiation causes less than 1% of spontaneous mutations.
Right, so even tripling the total radiation dose, natural plus man-made, wouldn't triple the total mutation rate. It might increase the overall rate by only a few percent. Still an increase, but maybe not catastrophic.
And there was another difference noted between somatic and genetic effects initially: the dose rate.
Yes. For somatic damage, getting the dose slowly is much better. Allows time for repair.
But for genetic effects, the early fruit fly work suggested the total accumulated dose was all that mattered. Slow or fast, the damage just added up in the sex cells.
That was the picture based on the early Drosophila studies, however.
There's a however.
There is. The book then introduces newer research from the 1950s and 60s, specifically work by W. L. Russell using mice at Oak Ridge National Laboratory.
Mice being mammals, much closer to humans genetically than flies.
Exactly. And the results were, well, complex and quite surprising.
For surprise, mice were more sensitive.
Yes. Per unit of radiation dose, mice showed about 15 times more mutations in the specific genes studied than fruit flies did, which, on the face of it, sounds worrying for us mammals.
15 times more sensitive. Yeah, that doesn't sound great.
But then came the second, really significant finding. In mice, unlike the earlier fly results, the rate at which the radiation dose was delivered did matter for genetic effects, especially in males.
How so?
A dose delivered slowly, at a low rate, produced significantly fewer mutations in the offspring than the exact same total dose delivered quickly, at a high rate.
So getting the radiation dose spread out over time reduced the genetic damage in mice. That contradicts the earlier accumulation idea from flies.
It does, and the book discusses why this might be. One idea, particularly for males who constantly produce sperm, was maybe undamaged sperm cells simply outcompete or drown out the few damaged ones when the damage occurs slowly. Dilution, basically.
Plausible, maybe. But what about females?
Well, that's where it gets even more interesting. Female mammals are born with pretty much all the egg cells they'll ever have. There isn't the same continuous production or potential for dilution. Yet the experiments on female mice also showed a lower mutation rate when the radiation dose was delivered slowly.
Which points away from simple dilution.
And points towards the second possibility, an active repair mechanism within the mammalian sex cells themselves.
A way for the cell to fix the radiation damage before it becomes a permanent mutation?
Potentially, yes. If the damage happens slowly enough, perhaps the cell's own repair systems can keep up and fix a good portion of it.
So the plot thickens. We might be more sensitive per dose than flies, but maybe we also have better repair systems, at least for low dose rate exposure.
That's the hopeful implication the book discusses. It suggests that our greater initial vulnerability might be partly offset by this repair capacity.
A hopeful sign, as they put it, but they also add a note of caution.
Yes, they stress these mouse studies looked at only a handful of genes. It wasn't clear how universally these findings applied, and more research was definitely needed to understand the full picture for humans.
Okay, so given this complex picture, the natural load, the effects of radiation, the dose rate question, the repair possibility, what's the bottom line from Asimov and Dobzhansky? What's their conclusion?
They're very pragmatic. They state clearly that just banning all uses of man-made radiation isn't realistic or even desirable. The benefits in medicine, research industry are just too great.
Can't uninvent the technology.
Exactly. But they argue strongly, minimizing unnecessary exposure is absolutely critical. We need to be much more careful.
They specifically praise the nuclear test ban treaty that had recently been signed.
Yes, the 1963 treaty between the US, UK, and Soviet Union banning atmospheric tests. They saw that as vital for stopping the continuous release of global fallout, which affects everyone.
And they single out medical x-rays again?
Yes, given it was the largest contributor to the man-made dose at the time. They argue for much greater circumspection. X-rays shouldn't be routine. The benefit needs to clearly outweigh the risk in each case. They even suggest keeping a personal record, a history, of your lifetime X-ray exposure to help doctors make informed decisions. Quite forward-thinking for the time.
They also touch on setting safety limits, maximum permissible exposure levels for the public.
They do. They mentioned that some geneticists at the time were suggesting an average maximum total dose of 10 rads, or REMs. The units were often used interchangeably then in this context, above natural background, accumulated over the first 30 years of life.
The main reproductive years.
Right. And they estimate that this 10 rad limit might increase the overall spontaneous mutation rate by about 10%.
Which they consider serious.
Definitely serious, but potentially a bearable increase if the alternative, giving up the benefits of radiation, would lead to more suffering overall. It's framed as this difficult societal trade-off.
Balancing lives against lives, as they put it.
A tough calculation. But they also offer some reassurance, suggesting that a 10% increase in mutations isn't likely to cause the extinction or serious degeneration of the human race.
They use an analogy, like a tissue population.
Yeah, where the vast majority of unaffected cells can compensate for a smaller number of damaged ones. Humanity as a whole could absorb that level of increased genetic load, they argued.
And one final point they tackle, the idea that maybe more mutations could be good, speed up evolution, create supermen.
Yes, they shoot that idea down quite firmly.
Why? What's their reasoning?
They argue the existing human gene pool already has vast amounts of variation, more than enough raw material for natural selection to work with as environments change. Adding more mutations randomly through radiation isn't like targeted improvement, it's just adding more random changes, and we know most random changes are harmful. Their analogy is great. It's like taking out a second mortgage on a perfectly good house that's already heavily mortgaged.
You don't need it, and it just adds burden and risk.
Exactly. It adds genetic load we don't need and potentially damaging changes the species can't afford.
Wow. So this deep dive into the genetic effects of radiation really unpacks a lot. The sheer complexity of inheritance, the constant background hum of natural mutation, and then how this powerful force radiation interacts with it all.
It really does. It highlights the incredible intricacy, the resilience, but also the definite vulnerability of our genetic code. And it brings home the immense responsibility that comes with developing and using technologies that can tweak that code, at life's most fundamental level.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? Especially that mouse research suggesting a repair mechanism for radiation damage, particularly at low dose rates. What could that mean for how our bodies handle the constant low-level exposures we get today from, well, all sorts of sources, not just medical, but environmental, technological?
It's a fascinating question.
And could we ever understand that repair process well enough to perhaps boost it, protect ourselves better? Lots to think about there. Definitely something to mull over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope it gave you some valuable insights from this classic source and maybe sparked some new questions.